quote of the day: be strong because things will get better. It may be stormy now, but it never rains forever. So our problems are temporary. They seem big now, but we'll work through them if we're strong. It won't last forever. Okay, so we're going to continue today a series of lessons that we've been doing for a while that I call Doing Social Studies. And rather, what we're doing, I think at least one of you hasn't been here for one of these before. Rather, since we've got 5 or 6 different courses that we're taking in social studies, there's no way I can give a lesson that exactly pertains to everybody's specific course. So what we're focusing on are social studies skills that the state standards think that y'all should have by the time you get out of high school. So what we're doing today, we're looking at analyzing, contrasting historical accounts of a period called the Great Awakening. And we're looking at these skills from the state standards, analyzing and evaluating evidence, arguments, claims, and beliefs, and in working with social studies information to draw conclusions. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at contrasting viewpoints and analyzing, interpreting, and synthesizing historical evidence with contrasting viewpoints. And our central question today we're going to answer is, why was George Whitefield so popular? And we're going to find out who he was and why he was so popular. So let me move to... Now I have, to start things out, I have a short video that's about 1.5 minutes long that gives an introduction to the period called the Great Awakening. This guy speaks very quickly. He puts out a lot of information very fast. I want you to listen, and then at the end you're going to be able to tell me what the Great Awakening was about.
And so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, so my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching.
So, Olivia, what was the Great Awakening concerned with? Anybody got an idea what it was concerned with? With what?
Religion.
That's correct. It was about religion. It was a religious awakening. Now, what I've got for you now is a short presentation that'll give you some background on the Great Awakening. And once we get through that, then we're going to look at some actual historical documents from different viewpoints and look at one of the major figures of the Great Awakening, George Whitefield. So the Great Awakening took place in the 1730s through the 1740s in the 13 American colonies. What was the Great Awakening? It was a religious revival period. This is a picture here of George Whitefield, the guy we're talking about today, preaching to a crowd of people. But it was a period when, as the man in the video said, Americans went from being religious people to being very religious people. That's what revival means, is in a religious sense, is becoming revived, more religious. So before the Great Awakening, what were the churches like in the colonies? Well, there were two main churches. Up in Massachusetts and New England, Connecticut, those colonies up there, you remember the Puritans had been in charge. And the church for the Puritans was called the Congregational Church. It was called Congregationalism. And that was the biggest religion in New England. Now the Puritans, they had broken away from the Church of England to come over to start their colonies. But their church had become the established church in New England, the Congregational Church. The other big church in the colonies was the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. And that was popular in the colony of New York and also in the southern colonies, to include South Carolina. The Church of England was very popular there. So these were the two established churches in the 1730s, and then this period called the Great Awakening begins. And we start to have a conflict between what are called Old Lights and New Lights. The Old Light churches are the established churches, the Congregationalists we talk about with the Puritans, and the Anglican churches. The New Light churches are the new churches that started up during the Great Awakening. And we're talking denominations like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists. You know, have you noticed that when you drive around Pickens County, you can't go more than 3 or 4 miles without seeing a Baptist church? Y'all ever notice that? They're everywhere. Well, this is the period when the Baptist church became very popular, particularly in the South. But the Methodist church was also popular during this time, and the Presbyterian church. And these New Light churches were a threat to the established Old Light churches. And this caused a conflict. And this started up during the Great Awakening. And the main message of the Great Awakening was you didn't need these established churches. Anybody could be converted and born again, and you didn't need that traditional church leadership to make that happen. So two of the main leaders of the Great Awakening, the one on the right is a preacher named Jonathan Edwards. He was actually from Massachusetts. And if you've taken or will take American literature, you probably at some point will read a famous sermon that Jonathan Edwards wrote called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But he was a very popular preacher during this period of the Great Awakening. But even more popular was this Englishman named George Whitefield. He was actually born in England, lived most of his life in England, but he came to the 13 colonies and went through all the 13 colonies preaching. And we're going to look at him today in detail. So the big question today, the central historical question, is why was George Whitefield so popular? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand you each a document, and I'm going to hand you a graphic organizer. And as we go through each of these documents, I'd like you to fill in the graphic organizer for the document. I'll talk through it in a second. Here's document A and your graphic organizer. Document A. Graphic organizer. Now, from our previous classes, what's the first thing we do when we look at a historical document? Y'all remember? First thing we do is we look at the source of it. But let me back up and go through the graphic organizer real quick. So for each of these documents we have on the graphic organizer, it will give the author of the document. You'll have a space to take notes about the source, a space to summarize the main idea, and then a space to answer the question here in a hypothesis, according to document A, why was George Whitefield so popular? So after we read each of these documents, you're going to answer that question based on the document of why you think George Whitefield was so popular. So that's the graphic organizer. And it's best to go ahead and fill this out as we go along. I'm going to model how to source and contextualize the first document. I'll guide you through the second, and then the third you'll be doing on your own. So when we get to document A, first thing we do is we source the document. So let's look at what information it has here about the source. It says it's the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. It's from 1793. And Ben Franklin was a good friend of George Whitefield, though he did not agree with his religious beliefs. Well, what do we know about Ben Franklin? Well, he's on the $100 bill. Does anybody remember that? He was one of the founding fathers. He was an inventor. He was a very self-educated man. He was a very popular publisher. He was very important in the colonies. We're looking at an important person with Benjamin Franklin. He was not particularly religious. So that tells us something about it. So it says he's a good friend of Whitefield, but he didn't really agree with his religious beliefs. So it's hard from that to predict what he'll say about him. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and read the actual document, and then we'll look at the context. So read along with me as I read this, please. Mr. Whitefield went preaching all the way through the colonies to Georgia, where there were many helpless children unprovided for. The sight of their miserable situation inspired the benevolent heart of Mr. Whitefield with the idea of building an orphan house there in which they might be supported and educated. Returning northward, he preached up this charity and made large collections. I happened to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I realized he intended to finish with a collection, and I silently decided he should get nothing from me. And it says in brackets that Franklin thought the orphan house should be built in Philadelphia, not in Georgia. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pieces in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and I decided to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. He had a loud and clear voice, and articulated his words and sentences so perfectly that he might be heard and understood at a great distance, especially as his audiences, however numerous, were completely silent. He preached one evening, and I computed that he might well be heard by more than 30,000. So based on this, the context we get out of this, well, first of all, we see that Whitefield had preached through all the colonies and gone down to Georgia and decided to start an orphanage in Georgia. Now, we do know that Georgia was started for very poor people. They sent a lot of people to Georgia because they were in debt. So maybe that's why they needed an orphanage down there, because they couldn't afford to build one of their own. Maybe, we'll see. Also, from what Franklin says, Whitefield was an extremely effective and persuasive speaker, because remember it says at the beginning he wasn't going to give any money to this collection. But gradually, as this sermon went on, he decided first to give his copper money, then to give his more valuable silver money, and then he ended up giving all the money he had, including the gold. And so he emptied it entirely into the collector's dish, gold and all. And then the third thing we get from it is that Whitefield had an exceedingly loud voice. Because Franklin, well, he says he had a loud and clear voice. But he's computing that he could be heard by 30,000 people. Now picture this. This is in the 1700s, when they didn't have loudspeakers or sound systems or anything like that. How many of you think it's accurate that somebody at that time could speak to 30,000 people. What do you think, Julie? You think it could happen? You know, what's the most people you think somebody could speak to? Yeah, well, according to Benjamin Franklin, he could speak to 30,000. If he could, he certainly had a loud voice, and that would help make him more popular. So let's go ahead then and fill in the graphic organizer for document A. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll look at document B. If y'all finished filling it in, raise your hand and let me know you finished. And I'll go ahead and give document B out while you're doing that.
I need Hunter Byrd for early dismissal, please.
Okay, guys, we're going to go on to document B now. So who wrote document B and why? What does it tell us here about the source of document B? Julia, read the part there about the source, please, on document B.
Nathan Cole was a farmer from Middletown, Connecticut, who worked for George Whitefield Bridge in 1741. Your experience convinced Cole to consolation and born again. The expert develops from his personal account.
Okay, so what kind of document is this? It's a personal account. He wrote down what had happened to him. Was George, or was Nathan Cole, was he a famous person or an ordinary person? What do you think? Well, he says here, it says he was a farmer from Connecticut, so he's probably an ordinary person. So we don't know a whole lot about him other than that, but because of the fact it says he became born again, does that mean he likely approved or disapproved of George Whitefield? You think he liked Whitefield or didn't like Whitefield? Olivia, what do you think? Shay, any idea? You think he liked Whitefield or not? Priscilla? Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see if he did or not. So I'm going to read through document B. I was born February 15, 1711, and born again October 1741. When I heard that Mr. Whitefield was coming to preach in Middletown, I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool and ran home to my wife and told her to hurry. My wife and I rode my horse as fast as I thought the horse could bear. When we reached Middletown, I heard a noise like a low rumbling thunder and soon saw it was the noise of horses' feet. As I came closer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, all of a lather and foam with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils with every jump. Every horse seemed to go with all his might to carry his rider to hear news from heaven for the saving of souls. It made me tremble to see the sight, how the world was in a struggle. When we got to the meeting house, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people assembled. I turned and looked back, and the land and banks of the river looked black with people and horses all along the 12 miles. When I heard Mr. Whitefield, or when I saw Mr. Whitefield, he looked almost angelic, a young, slim, slender youth. And hearing how God was with him everywhere, it put me into a trembling fear. I saw my righteousness would not save me. So, this what do we get about what things were like at this time? Do you think in this time people were more religious than they are now in general? Have I got an idea on that? Jay? Well, we already talked about people were religious, but they became more religious during the Great Awakening. There's a lot in this document on context. We've already talked about the sourcing of this document, but there's a lot in context that we can get from this. One thing, it was unusual to have a revival meeting like this anywhere when the author of the piece of document B, Mr. Cole, when Cole heard that this meeting was going on, he dropped his tools in the field and hurried up and got his wife, and they hurried as fast as they could to it. And then when they got there, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people there. And it was very unusual at that time to have gatherings as big as 3,000 or 4,000 people. He was very excited in the way he wrote, too. He talks about how the horses knew that the riders were excited, and it seems like the horses wanted to hurry up there so they could get to the meeting. And so we'll go ahead now and ask the question, why, according to document B, why was Whitefield so popular? So guys, go ahead and fill in your graphic organizer for document B, and then we'll discuss it and go to document C.